So greetings again. Today, I'd like to go through this question, this issue of questioning disaster capitalism in the Caribbean, fostering pathways beyond disaster capitalism. This presentation was supported by our senior research assistant, Dr. Andre Habe, and Miss Christina Doherty, who is our junior research assistant, who's a graduate student at University of the West Indies. So let me begin. Caribbean futures are being forged in the crucible of globalization and climate change. Yet with the intensification of the climate crisis, the region is being exposed to a rapid surge in development projects and foreign investments that are sacrificing local community rights and are environmentally destructive. This phenomenon has been described as disaster capitalism, a term popularized by Naomi Klein in 2007. She's a Canadian writer, journalist, and activist. She has argued that, and I quote, "Every time a new crisis hits, the fear and disorientation that follow are harnessed for radical social and economic engineering," end of quote. However, for Caribbean spaces to be sustainable, then models of accumulation that thrive on crisis and the racial legacies of structural violence from colonialism must be resisted. And the high modernist visions of development that multiply and create disaster risk in the name of progress must be debunked. In their stead, more effort must rest on placing people's voices at the center of our approaches to development, climate change adaptation, and mitigation in the region. In this introduction, I will examine the character of disaster capitalism and speak to a new project on disaster capitalism in the Caribbean region, which is being funded by the Open Society Foundations, which is seeking to mobilize and support communities at risk to advance climate justice and alternative models of change that can enhance both regional food and decolonial futures. So Latin America and the Caribbean, as a bit of background, are considered the second most disaster-prone region in the world, with 152 million persons affected by 1,205 disasters between 2000 and 2019. The region is exposed to a range of hydrometeorological hazards, namely hurricanes, floods, and droughts, as well as geological hazards, such as earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and landslides. According to the World Bank, the impacts of these hazards have resulted in an average loss of almost US $1.6 billion per year between 1998 and 2018. In some countries, the extent of the damage exceeds the size of the economy. For example, when Hurricane Maria impacted on Dominica, it cost the country 225% of its GDP. The impact of disasters is a growing concern then, as the region experiences more frequent extreme events occurring concurrently or in rapid succession in different states in the context of climate change. As we all know, we are now looking at the possible path of Hurricane Brett in the region, which will impact on the Leeward Islands and other states within the Caribbean sphere. However, while SIDS and the Caribbean region are exposed to multiple hazards, historical, social, cultural, economic, institutional, and political structures and forces result in differential impacts and losses across the region. For example, Haiti had the highest number of deaths. Haiti had the highest number of deaths caused by natural hazards, standing at 8,608 between 1980 and 2009, as a result of floods and landslides from meteorological systems. However, Cuba, a country with the second highest number of disaster events over the same period, has an estimated death toll of just 193 to 203. A similar contrast could be drawn between Haiti and the rest of the Caribbean as well, in terms of their experiences of hunger and food insecurity. These differences in socio-political vulnerability across the region are thus principal determinants of the susceptibility to both the slow violence of racial histories, as well as sudden disasters, which elicit in their wake disaster capitalism. Disaster capitalism has been conceptualized as a utilization of catastrophic events as a window of opportunity for political reforms and/or economic profiteering. Thus, disaster capitalism is a process by which governments and private sectors benefit from disasters, either economically or politically, at all scales. This includes benefiting from the displacement or disempowerment of the affected population, the centralization of decision-making post-emergency, the long-term dependence on international aid, and the relaxation or the repeal of socioeconomic regulations and legislation. These circumstances of vulnerability allow for the creation of policies that favors liberalization, deregulation, and transnational interests. And as Sandoval et al. Have shown in their global case studies of disaster capitalism, examining the role of private and public sector, and I quote, "When the decision-making space is occupied by self-interested actors, it poses a challenge to all disaster risk reduction and resilience efforts that are being made by citizens, communities, national and local governments, and international organizations." This exposure to disaster capitalism is magnified in the context of Caribbean histories under globalization and the legacy of plantation economy, which has tilted Caribbean economies around tourism, agriculture, and natural resource extraction industries. Thus, while the state of the country's vulnerability to natural hazards is a multifactorial problem, given geographical location, environmental and economic characteristics in the region, these physical states of vulnerability may be compounded rather than reduced by the forms of global and local development projects that are taking place. In brief, disasters are largely socially constructed. Disaster capitalism may thus be more broadly defined as the exploitation of those non-natural disasters tied to hurricanes, wars, economic crises, or pandemics, as well as to the longer-term economic and socio-political vulnerabilities arising from neoliberal development and colonial philosophies of primitive accumulation based on the racial logic of extraction. As such, the multitemporal phenomena of disaster capitalism is not inevitable, but rather depends on the policies and practices of enabling states and a global political environment that is being shaped by racial capitalism. As pointed out by the contrastive examples of Haiti and Cuba, histories of structural violence and capitalist development have placed racialized populations at an acute disadvantage. From this perspective, then, I support the argument by disaster risk scholars Ben Wisner and Alan Naval that one needs a critical shift from discourses of disaster risk reduction and resilience in order to embrace a new paradigm of resisting disaster risk creation. The imposition of disaster capitalism in the Caribbean has been met with resolute resistance, with local grassroots organizations raising their voices against injustices, loss of access to resources, and increased marginalization. Recent examples of indigenous and grassroots actors mobilizing for justice against the historical and contemporary timelines of disaster capitalism in the Caribbean include the Maya people of Toledo District, who organized against the government of Belize and received a successful judgment from the Caribbean Court of Justice in 2015 on their rights to their communally owned lands. Similarly, the Grenada Land Actors received a favorable but contested judgment last year in the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court of Appeal against the government of Grenada and foreign developers supporting their right of access to environmental justice with respect to the impact of development on the environment. In addition, we could speak to also the stalwart resistance of the people of Barbuda, who are actively challenging the government of Antigua and Barbuda through the UK Privy Council, given recent development projects implemented in Barbuda in the post-hurricane context of Irma and Maria in September 2017. Because these projects have rested on the negation of their communal land tenure system. Also impacted by the Category 5 Hurricane Irma and Maria in the same year, the people of Puerto Rico continue to resist the wave of dispossession that is taking place as the disaster has become a haven for investors to capitalize on lax tax laws and struggling real estate markets, in addition to the government's continuing attempts at privatization of the educational and energy sectors. All of this is acting to further marginalize residents. Also want to point here briefly to the Rizal people in Colombia and their fight for the protection of their indigenous heritage, their rights to food and environment in the context of Hurricane Iota, which reached the San Andres Archipelago on the 16th of November, 2020. These several examples all point to the need for regional solidarity to bring greater awareness to the nature of these complex disasters and sociopolitically constructed risks impacting the region. Given this context then of political, environmental, and social precarity, as well as resistance, the project Disaster Capitalism in the Caribbean, Networking, Sharing, and Learning from Community Responses, supported by a 2022 grant from the Open Society Foundations, aims to share the stories and experiences of regional grassroots organizations with disaster capitalism at varying scales. This project builds on previous work from a 2020 UK Global Challenges Research Fund, the GCRF, which funded a project entitled Food Insecurity at the Time of Climate Change. This was led by Bristol University with principal investigator then being Dr. Jessica Paddock. This GCRF project unified 4 academic partners and 5 grassroots civil society organizations across 5 Caribbean countries, namely Barbuda, Belize, Colombia, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. This fostered the creation of a regional community and website. This fostered the creation of a regional community and website, Stronger Caribbean Together, to strengthen grassroots organizations' efforts to address food insecurity and climate issues. That is the StrongerCaribbeanTogether.org website. The previous project, which ended in 2022, March 2022, also enabled grassroots organizations to identify connections between their problems and provide pathways towards solutions. Our current project proposes dialogue and knowledge exchange between non-state actors to empower and equip organizations to challenge local disaster capitalism projects and policies. The international exchange of ideas from multiple partners across the region to share their experiences not only unifies the region, but also allows locals in the region to identify the political patterns that are often constructed as exceptions. With this project, we seek to expand the current network of partners to approximately 20 grassroots organizations across the region to fill 3 gaps, namely the lack of transnational network, the lack of a digital space for knowledge and information sharing, and the lack of access, or limited access rather, to legal advocacy and support. The project will thus share the stories and experiences of the project partners and make them easily accessible for online access. Sorry, I repeat, and make them easily accessible online for additional support, and will provide the project partners access to international actors operating around legal advocacy and support. Through these means, then, we wish to help to amplify the voices of the project partners and build bridges to additional support for their struggles. To date, the following groups are members of our network: Agro Providencia in Colombia, which is an association supporting indigenous rights through food security and food sovereignty in Providencia and Santa Catalina. The Bernard Lodge Farmers Group in Jamaica, that is advocating for the rights and needs of farmers that occupied Bernard Lodge lands and have been recently displaced, significant numbers of them. Grenada Land Actors is an independent network of professionals, non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, private land users, and activists that are promoting equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development of Grenada land's resources. The Julian Cho Society in Belize is a non-profit, non-governmental membership organization for the Mayan community dedicated to the conservation of the environment and indigenous lands of southern Belize. WAVE is an association of the Progressive Reform Movement. It's the Waitukubuli Advocates for Viable Environments. Apologies for mispronunciation if I did. And they are WAVE, an organization that is trying to document, publicize environmental damages and destruction across the nation through various outlets. Then we have the Rizal Youth Organization in Colombia, which is an ethnic-based organization that struggles for the rights of self-determination of the Rizal people in the archipelago of St. Andres in Colombia. We have Save Barbuda, which is a group of local and foreign advocates for socio-economic, socio-environmental justice in Barbuda that are opposing developments which cause irreversible negative impacts and are incompatible with the rights of people and the environment. We have the Carl Levesque Cultural Institute from Haiti. And ICKL is a non-religious, non-profit private foundation with no political affiliations, promoting the experiences of and struggles of organizations in Haiti. The Tetkole Peza Haiti, Tetkole for short, is a solidarity organization, national solidarity organization of peasants and small farmers, which since 2007 have been supporting concrete projects in Haiti, given the problems faced by succession of natural disasters. The the Canyon Martin Pena Community Land Trust is the instrument used by the residents of 7 communities adjacent to the Canyon Martin Pena, initially informal settlements, to control and lead the development of nearly 200 acres of land located in San Juan, Puerto Rico, without putting its residents at risk of displacement. Most recently, we have invited and they have accepted La Colmena Cimarrona practices in Vieques, Puerto Rico, which practices solidarity economy, agroecology, and beekeeping with the intention of flourishing food sovereignty in the Puerto Rican archipelago. In this webinar, we'll be spotlighting the cases of Grenada and Barbuda. And as I indicated before, we won't be able to speak to Colombia given the network challenges. I wish to close by briefly highlighting our network building methodology. 3 methods are being used to identify partners, namely snowballing, online keyword searches, and the use of Ramsar protected areas and environmental justice map searches. Snowballing is a technique in which additional partners were recommended from referral from existing project partners. And through this, we're able to identify partners in Haiti, Grenada, and Dominica. In addition to snowballing, we are looking at online keyword searches on environmental activism, land rights, food sovereignty in the context of disaster capitalism. And this was done to help identify additional partners and to ensure that the additional partners that are flagged are reflective of the different regions across the Caribbean. A list of each Caribbean country was placed in an Excel sheet and organized by the location and governance structure of each country. Once organizations are identified online, they are subsequently investigated to ensure that the organizations are still active. Finally, complementing the online keyword searches, the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice and the Ramsar websites were used to locate environmental hotspots, protected environmental areas, and local resistance to displacement or the loss of rights to land and the environment, which may have been triggered by the conjunctures of climate change and disaster capitalism. Ultimately, through this project, we are building and supporting a regional community of resistance to disaster capitalism and disaster risk creation by embracing the right to say no in order to sustain our rights to life, dignity, food, and the environment. Thank you for your attention. So we are very happy to move into the main content of our presentation of our webinar today, which will feature our community activists, and we will have Ms. Christina Doherty, who is our research assistant, guide us first by presenting a brief profile on the impact of disasters in the region, trends that we have identified for bringing a closer view of these issues towards you. And Christina, I'll now turn over the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm hoping everybody is able to hear me and see my screen. Yes? Okay. So today I'll be doing a brief overview on the trends and impacts of disasters in the Caribbean. And I'm going to start by reporting that between 1998 and 2017, disaster-hit countries experienced losses valued at $2,908 billion. And to contextualize what that means for the Caribbean, we are the second most disaster prone in the region with over 1,000 disasters between 2000 and 2019. And what disasters are most felt within the region? Primary disasters includes floods from storms, as well as storms, earthquakes, droughts, landslide, extreme temperature events, volcanic eruptions, and wildfires. So we can see that the Caribbean is a hotspot for multiple disasters. We experience not only hydrometeorological disasters, but also geological disasters. And hydrometeorological disasters are those that are related to climate, and that would include your extreme rainfall events generating floods, storm events, droughts, extreme temperatures. And some of these disasters also have secondary impacts. For example, storms may trigger landslides. You may have maroonage, droughts, and extreme temperature events, what that would mean for the agriculture industry or heat stress. And so we are in the Caribbean are faced with not only multiple disasters, but sometimes disasters happening concurrently. Additionally, it is anticipated that climate change will exacerbate the frequency of our hazards, including floods, storms, and droughts, further increasing the vulnerabilities of the region. Geotechnical hazards also pose a threat, and we have seen in recent years how earthquakes have had a damaging impact on the Caribbean, for example, in Haiti, as well as our volcanic eruptions in St. Vincent and the Grenadines have had an impact not only on the island, but also neighboring countries, for example, Barbados, who was impacted by the ash cloud. And so when we look at damage and loss within the region, let me go back. We can see that the last decade between 2010 and 2019 was the highest recorded damage and loss from tropical storms, the second most prone disaster in the region. So between 1980 to 1989, the loss and damage was estimated at $261 million US, and that number continued to increase. As you can see, it rose to 490 in 1990 to 1999, 493 between 2000 and 2009, and more recently, $3,600 million, which was primarily driven by a Category 5 hurricane seen between 2020 and 2019. We're also seeing a trend where disasters are becoming not only more frequent, but also happening concurrently or in rapid succession. Some examples include Hurricane Dorian, a Category 5 hurricane lasting 3 days over the island of Bahamas, resulting in a damage of US $2.5 billion. When they were previously impacted by Hurricane Matthew in 2016 with an estimated damage of $373 million. So those are disasters happening back to back, providing limited time for countries within the region to adequately recover and put structures in place to move forward. Another example is seen in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where in 2021, they were simultaneously impacted by a COVID-19 pandemic, a dengue fever outbreak, volcanic eruptions, and Hurricane Maria. Another popular example is in 2017, two Category 5 hurricanes, Irma and Maria, made landfall within the Eastern Caribbean between September 6 to 19, also signaling the rapid succession of disasters. Hurricanes Irma and Maria resulted in the deaths of at least 37 people, where thousands were made homeless. Infrastructure for transportation, water, health, and tourism were devastated. While we're experiencing differences in the disaster impacts, and while we're also seeing an increasing trend in disasters happening more simultaneously or in rapid succession, we also understand that the region has differential vulnerability. What does that mean? Well, there are several factors that influence its vulnerability in the Caribbean. Different factors such as historical, social, cultural, economic, and institutional structures result in differential impacts in damage and loss across the region. Dr. Northover raised the example of Haiti having 8,608 deaths by natural hazards between 1980 and 2009, as opposed to Cuba, who had a death toll of 193 to 203 with the same number of disasters or more. So we can see that disasters have differential impacts on countries, and there are different factors that lead to these disasters. One example would be differences in disaster risk management structures. Countries that have limited structures in place to adequately prepare, respond, and recover from disasters. Limited investment in physical structures. Some countries have better infrastructure in place. These infrastructure may be shelter management, road infrastructure, land use zoning policy, as well as human resources, skilled persons within the country that are able to effect and enact policies, laws, put structures in place for disaster risk management. We've also seen how loans and structural adjustment programs impact vulnerability across the region, where countries who are tied to these programs have different responsibilities to pay back loans, and so less time, energy, and money is invested in other aspects of disaster management. Rapid urbanization and its impact on urban centers in the Caribbean, as well as economies that are centered around tourism and agriculture, are extremely sensitive to disasters. We have seen where climate change can result in beach erosion, beach loss, and storms, not even at Category 5, a Category 1 hurricane, what that impact can look like on agricultural structures. And so, as previously mentioned, these differential vulnerability impacting the region has also led to the susceptibility of disaster capitalism. And I won't delve too much into what disaster capitalism is, as Dr. Northover went through it in detail, but in essence, it is the process by which government or private sectors benefit from disasters, either economically or politically at scale. Hold on. Sorry about that. Let me continue. So disaster capitalism includes the displacement or disorientation of affected population. It includes centralization of decision-making power, long-term dependence on international aid, as well as the relaxation or repeal of socioeconomic regulations. These activities allow for the creation of policies that favor liberalization, deregulation, and transnational interests. So in essence, we can see that the nature of disasters within the region is changing. Events are becoming more intense, unpredictable, and frequent. The vulnerability to disasters in the region is not equal, where different countries and groups experience differences in disaster impacts, and that there is a growing trend in the region to profit from disaster events, further exacerbating vulnerability to disasters. And so the next segment of this presentation or of this webinar will feature different community partners sharing their experience on disaster capitalism and how it has had an impact on them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your overview, reinforcing points that we were making earlier in the presentation and highlighting some of the damages that have been impacted and the character of the risks that we are facing within the Caribbean region. I'm very happy to say that we have with us now representatives from Save Barbuda and the Grenada Land Actors, and we will now turn to the session in this program, which will be focusing on the community voices and their experiences with disaster capitalism. This section will be moderated by Christina Doherty, who is our junior research assistant, and she has a background in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. And she is also a member of the Future Leaders Network on Early Warning, Early Action Systems, and the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Organization to engage youth across Latin America and the Caribbean in disaster risk reduction activities. So Christina, thank you for your very wonderful overview and clear presentation on the issues related to the impact of disasters in the region and reinforcing the points on disaster capitalism that were raised. We turn the floor over to you. And after that, we will have a short break once the community discussion has taken place.
Thank you. I see John is online and ready to share on his experiences from Save Barbuda. And so I'm going to begin with John, and I'm also going to facilitate John's session by sharing his slide for him. So whenever you want me to change the slide, John, you could always say so. So I'm going to hand over the floor to John who will now begin. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to now hand over the floor to John, who will now begin speaking on his experience representing Save Barbuda.
Thank you, Christina. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, let us begin with the first slide. And it's definitely an honor and privilege to be in this group this morning. And I am particularly grateful because you have set the groundway in terms of explaining what disaster capitalism is. And so that makes my task easier. So let me begin by saying a brief background on Barbuda. Barbuda had a unique history in terms of these smaller islands throughout the period of enslavement. It is one of those islands which never had a plantation, as it were, sugar, cotton, or anything like that. And it was leased by a British citizen, the Codgingtons, for the duration of the period of enslavement. And so it was used more for supplying other plantations, the Codgington plantations throughout the region as far as Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean. As a result of that, the Barbudan people were able to carry out a lot of their traditions, and in particular, one of communal land systems, which they brought with them from Africa. And so throughout the entire period of slavery, Barbudans, the enslaved Barbudans, lived in a particular way. Next slide, please. Yes. So in 2007, Barbudans were able to formalize that system of communal land ownership through legislation in the form of the Barbuda Land Act. And that particular system had several advantages for the people of Barbuda. For one, it meant that there was equality of access and an equality of benefits. So once those resources which the land represents are available to all Barbudans, then you had a sense of equality in terms of those shared benefits. There was a sense of responsibility to others and to the common good for all those who shared the benefits. That was part of the Barbudan culture. In addition to that, with that sense of responsibility, there was now developed over those many centuries an ability, a sense of conservation, sustainability, and these were used as tools to safeguard and guarantee that future generations would have been able to enjoy the same benefits. And that was very important. That became part of the culture of Barbudans. You have to look out not only for yourself, but for the future generations. Now, today, you will see Barbuda in terms of that overall benefit. And in a nutshell, Barbuda can be described as a tiny tropical island with relatively spectacular natural resources compared to other islands. And that provides a rare experience of connectedness to nature. It is one of the few remaining places where one can live and experience the healing benefits of nature. Now, with a description like that, you can see why Barbuda would be such an attraction to persons who would see it as a means of benefiting themselves. So here's a picture taken somewhere around 2013 of Barbudan children, school children. It was at a camp, and they're basically on the east coast of Barbuda enjoying those things of nature, which you can only see, smell, and experience in Barbuda. Next slide, please. Now, what was our particular experience with regards to disaster capitalism? In 2017, we faced one of the strongest, most vicious Atlantic storms that the world has ever seen in recorded history. And as a result of that disaster, and I'm going to be dividing it into impacts and opportunity. Barbudans and Barbuda, we suffered the main force of that storm. We were impacted. And so the island was devastated. Barbudans were displaced because as a result of that storm, the central government decided to institute a state of emergency and, surprisingly, mandatory evacuation. There was stress, and you can only describe it as catastrophic stress. You not only were hit by this devastation, but then you were basically taken off of the island, having to leave, pet your belongings, not given the opportunity to do what was humanly normal in situations like that, pick up, clean up, and pull your life together. You're basically evacuated from the area and not hearing anything about it. Later on, we began hearing the term deracinated. And in fact, we were called by our Prime Minister deracinated imbeciles when we started to make a fuss and wanted to come back to Barbuda. Now, what we also learned was that there was an opportunity created, and that opportunity was more geared towards the central government and its investors, quote unquote, investors. And that was the reason behind the mandatory evacuation. And interestingly, what was declared when you examine the situation, there was a declaration of terra nullius, okay? Now that is an ancient concept. It is still used in some instances in law around the globe. But what it, in a sense, was saying is that persons or countries had a right to inhabit, to take over land which they considered was unoccupied. And it is the basis on which colonialism is justified. So all of a sudden in 2017, we were faced with this historic concept. And essentially, we realized that a policy decision was made to integrate all Barbudans, in other words, the population of Barbuda, integrate them into the sister island of Antigua. We had no say in that policy decision. We were not consulted. We were just, as objects, expected to comply. Next slide, please. So here you see a picture which was taken about 3 days after the Hurricane Irma struck, and this will show you the extent of the devastation that occurred. Next slide, please. Here's another picture. And shortly after that devastation, one would have expected that the community, the island, emphasis would have been placed on rebuilding, recovering. But to our surprise, we were held off the island, and then other developments began to take place. And these developments involved large-scale land clearing. There was forests cleared for the construction of an international airport. And then, for example, that picture shows an excavator working on the sand dunes in the Palmetto Point area of Barbuda, which is part of our national park, the Codgerton Lagoon National Park, and it's also a designated Ramsar site, okay? So that was the reality that we faced. Next slide, please. So the question may be asked, why did the central government seek to impose that sort of change? And remember what the nature of disaster capitalism is. There is a shock, there is stress, persons are disoriented, persons are in a state of mind which they would normally not be able to pull themselves together and to resist certain changes. So this particular change we learned was imposed on the entire community so as to create a luxury real estate market in Barbuda. Now remember, Barbuda in 2007 passed a legislation, the Barbuda Land Act, which brought into law the whole concept that the island was owned in common by the people of Barbuda and land shall not be sold. So that was the law. And so in order for you to create a luxury real estate market, in other words, you're going to be buying and selling lots, luxury lots of land, that could not happen if you had a legislation like that in place. And as part of the luxury real estate market, there were to be developed on the island several exclusive residential communities. Now, these are not tourism hotels or the traditional type of tourism which we are accustomed to in these islands. This is about residences, communities. And the thing we began to discover was that these communities, that word exclusive, was definitely something that was foreign to us, because we started to see the erection of 10-foot chain link fences, barbed wire, and military style security manning these areas, which essentially put it to you as a Barbudan, put it to us as Barbudans, you are no longer permitted to, you are no longer welcome, you cannot go to these areas. Now remember, you're talking about a community which came up historically, having the sense of ownership of all the resources, all the land, and all of a sudden you are attempting to do things which you normally do, like visit the beach, take a swim, gather sea grapes, gather straw and other material for doing whatever craft work and other things that you do. And all of a sudden you're confronted by these fences and security is telling you, you cannot pass here. And if you attempt to defy them, the police is called and they will attempt to arrest you. And these luxury or exclusive residential communities, they were put in place. And then we began to hear that Barbuda is going to be developing and promoting this private lifestyle culture. So you have persons in the world who have a lot of money and they live a particular type of lifestyle, which is private. They live in enclosed areas where others do not access. Now, who benefits most from these? Who are the players in this? It certainly was not Barbuda, it's not us. And so we've discovered the major beneficiaries for this system of disaster capitalists were these companies that emerged. You had one which is called Peace, Love and Happiness, Barbuda Limited, Discovery Land Company, Paradise Found, Barbuda Development Company Limited. Now look at the adjectives that are being used here. Paradise Found. In other words, for centuries, Barbudans worked to create an island which is well managed in terms of its resources, clean, healthy, and all of a sudden, somebody else is going to see it as paradise and they have found it. Terra nullius, okay? Next slide, please. And this sense of disaster capitalism, Barbudans immediately began to resist, because when they were evacuated in Antigua, once we found out what the true motives of the central government was all about, we said to ourselves, no way we're going to sit back and allow ourselves to be erased, to be deracinated, to be expunged from our culture and who we are. So the resistance started. And why do we resist? Because we came up as part of our culture having a sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility towards the resources that we own. We had food security. In 2012, a poverty assessment was done in Antigua and Barbuda. And essentially the findings from that poverty assessment was that in Barbuda, there wasn't any poverty as such. You didn't have vagrants, you didn't have persons eating out of garbage bins and walking the streets. That's compared to Antigua and other islands, which you had those things. You had fair access to the natural resources. Every member of the community can access the resources that he needs in terms of land, in terms of materials, in terms of anything which he needs to provide livelihoods and to secure himself, okay? The land for farming, farming in Barbuda is done under very adverse conditions. And that's why one of the reasons why the island was never used for sugarcane or cotton cultivation in terms of the mass plantation system. So the environment is very challenging. And so the farming systems which we developed and used, brought here by our ancestors, actually mimic what you would have seen in the Amazon basin in terms of slash and burn, biochar technology, and these sorts. We only now beginning to understand the technologies involved in that system, and that was the only way we could produce in Barbuda. That requires free access to land, and that's why it's so tied up to our food security. We also practice hunting and gathering, whether it be hunting for deer, wild boar, gathering land crabs, land turtles, other materials that we use for food and for other activities. It's dependent on having access to resources. Now, the marine resources around Barbuda are tremendous in that the lobster export industry, fish, and other seafood. It is one of the most productive islands in this Eastern Caribbean. And the Codrington Lagoon, which is protected, is also important to, for example, the lobster stocks throughout the entire region. And that's based on the requirements that lobsters have in terms of their reproduction. They need to migrate in the ocean seas, and they need areas in which to settle. And so those were some of the reasons why we resisted. We could not, as a people, seeing that our culture, who we are, was so closely tied to our resources and being able to access and to control those resources, to all of a sudden have that taken from us. And that was being done so as to facilitate the entire island being converted for the use of others. And that, in essence, is what disaster capitalism was about. And we are experiencing it. We have resisted, we have launched cases in the courts. We continue to use social media because we are faced with persons who have tremendous amount of resources and who can use social media and other media to basically paint a narrative which may not necessarily be true and which will ignore the people who are targets of this. So one of our greatest tools in terms of resisting all that was access to social media, being able to organize, being able to communicate to other Barbudans living in the diaspora, to communicate with other persons throughout the region who were experiencing these same types of tactics, and share ideas, share the ways and means by which you can actually withstand. Okay, so I think that is the final slide. So our whole aim, that picture with the pink sands, for those persons who have actually come to Barbuda, and for those of you who would not, you would not be able to imagine the type of resources, the cleanliness, the kind of experience that you would have on Barbuda. You can see a beach like that, and the only footprints you will see is your own. You will experience quietness like you would never have. Waters, gin clear. It's an experience, and that is the reason we fight to preserve that, because Barbuda is who we are. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for that brief overview on what is happening in Barbuda. It is so tragic to hear as you detail the case by step as to what happened before hurricane, after hurricane, and where your fight is now. We are going to move on to another community partner. This partner is the Grenada Land Actors, an independent network of professionals, non-government organizations, community-based organizations, private land users, and activists that are promoting equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development of Grenada land resources. We're going to hear from Aaron Caton, who was born in Carriacou, Grenada, and moved to the US when he was 10 years old. And although he still resides in upstate New York, preserving Grenada's natural environment for future generations through advocacy is very important to him. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Albany and an MBA in healthcare management from the University of St. Mary. He's also the owner of Nutmeg Partners, a small business which specializes in expedited logistics for major computer and hardware related companies. So Aaron will now be able to speak about what disaster capitalism looks like in Grenada, and hopefully the participants will be able to draw parallels with what's happening across the Caribbean. Aaron, I hand over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Ms. Doherty. So my name is Aaron Caton, and I represent the Grenada Land Actors. The Grenada Land Actors is a civic-based, non-political organization in Grenada that seeks to preserve our natural habitat and environment for future and unborn generations. Similar to the organizations that were mentioned earlier that are based in Haiti, we in Grenada have a very political and politically charged past where we, in order to gain traction, acceptance, and respectability, we needed to differentiate ourselves between politics and civics. And I say that because, like most Caribbean countries, if not all, there's a level of political victimization that happens once good-minded people like us speak up, not necessarily to personally benefit, but to make sure the system is fair, functional, and sustainable. So, like Ms. Doherty said, I left home a long time ago. Next week is going to be 40 years since I left as a little boy, but I never forgot the greenery, the freedom, the ability to walk free in Carriacou. Similar to the environment that Mr. Mussington talked about in Bermuda, where we also have the freedom to have the crabs, the lobsters, the everything minus tourism. We don't have any hotels in Carriacou or development. It's not to say that development is bad. I think we are all aware that from the time we were born to now, there has been development. And development is actually a good thing. It's something that will always be there. It's just that the manner in which it happens needs to be respectful of existing laws, of the environment, while being conscious that eventually we will all pass on. And we have, those of us who will have children, grandchildren, and so on, have to have an idea as to what life we would like for those future unborn generation to live in. So from a geographical standpoint, unlike Barbuda, Grenada is quite mountainous. We have a mountain ridge that runs almost the entire length of the island. And similar to what Dr. Northhour said in the beginning of her speech, our disaster capital isn't so much environmentally based or nature based. It's man-made, it's fiscally generated. What that means, I will go into detail a little bit more as far as how Grenada found itself in the position that it's in, where so much of its natural and pristine environment is being sold, carved up, fenced off, where the local population is being excluded from enjoying the same sceneries and freedom that our parents, grandparents, and future generations have. So, with the Grenada Land Actors, we saw fit to challenge the government of Grenada on what we perceive to be rampant development at the expense of willful avoidance and almost a pretension that the laws that govern the environment and govern the country does not exist. So Grenada has had successive physical planning laws on its books going back all the way to 1968, when we were still officially part of England. Grenada gained its independence in 1974. There have been physical planning laws successively in 2002, 2006, 2011. in 2016 even. And I'm not going to go into details as far as what all of those laws and amendments sought to do, but at their heart, it was meant to empower the local population to challenge development that was happening. And before I continue, I will say, development for me isn't so much a building or hotel or an airport, right? I think we have to talk about a true development comes from educating the population, building hospitals, and creating infrastructure that will enable the local population to maintain a livelihood, dignity, sustainability, whereby our people wouldn't have to worry about migrating to England, France, Canada, the United States, and other countries for a better life. That's just my opinion. So we in Grenada decided to challenge the physical planning department. We sought to do that because there were and are, even more now, developments that are happening without proper consultation and or environmental assessments. In Grenada proper, the country, the island, is approximately 120 square miles, just about 70,000 acres. And we have taken to court developments that are happening down in La Sagesse, which is in the southern part of Grenada. Adjacent to La Sagesse is Mount Hartman, which is home to the endemic and critically endangered Grenada national dove. When I say endemic, that means it's the only location that a species exists. The Grenada national dove is in our coat of arms, and it is right smack dab in the middle of a building structured development that not even the Prime Minister really knows what's happening. In theory, it's supposed to be a town for college and university students, but only for people who are from China. I will get into that a little bit later again. And that development is being built by the Singapore Hang Seng Corporation. In La Sagesse, there's a hotel chain that's being finalized. They're almost finished now by Range Developments Grenada in conjunction with the Intercontinental Hotel chain. And in La Vera, there is a mess that is happening up north, whereby just about 2% of Grenada's landmass, it is the largest, flattest area in the whole entirety of the country, whereby there will be a golf course, there is going to be a 500 hotel room complex, restricted access to the beach, where we have the leatherback turtles that are nesting. The leatherback turtles are the largest species of turtles in the world, at times reaching up to 3 meters in length, size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And excuse me, my phone is ringing. That shouldn't happen. So we are challenging that development from happening. There has been no provisions for water. As we know, in the Caribbean, there has been a prolonged drought. There is no provision that has been made for agricultural runoff. There has been no provision for sanitation and or additional and ancillary waste that will happen. But more than those things, we stand to lose the culture that we have, because as those people from out of town and out of other countries come to live on island, the population will be diluted. And that's the political aspect. But I know that we are short for time. You know, we're going to go into the fiscal nature of disaster capitalism in Grenada, and how we are at the point where all of these outsiders are buying properties, and it's due to bloated budget deficits as a result of successive hurricanes that happened in 2004 with Hurricane Ivan, and 2005 with Hurricane Emily, and the destruction of our nutmeg crop and our bananas. And now we are selling what we have to add money to a treasury at the expense of future generation. Thank you. I know we are out of time, but thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Aaron, for that presentation. I do appreciate how we're able to look at what's happening in Grenada with regards to Lassa gas and the development that's happening way after Hurricane Ivan, and probably before, God forbid, another disaster event, and look at what's also similarly happening in Barbuda. We previously mentioned that our original speaker, Marcella, would not be able to speak as a result of connectivity issues. However, speaking on behalf of Marcella for Agro Providencia, which is an association that promotes indigenous rights through food security and food sovereignty in Providencia and Santa Catalina, we have William Bush Howard, who is an experienced and committed professional in investment, international relations, and public affairs in Latin America and the Caribbean. William is experienced in marketing strategy development, new market entry, sales management, and business development, with more than 20 years working in the public and private sector in the Western Hemisphere. He has also lectured at several universities in the region, with a network of contacts from academia to the financial world, particularly in North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So, Mr. William, I'm going to now ask if you could present a little bit about Agro Providencia and their struggle in disaster capitalism.
Oh, Christina, thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me to take the floor. And also I would like to thank Catalina from National University, and someone that have been working with our community for the last 20 years. So I appreciate that. In the 1940, Providence Island was hit by a hurricane, and two generations of islanders believe that was the worst hurricane can even hit Old Providence. In the 60s, we had another hurricane that was not so strong, I think it was number 3. But in November of 2020, Iota hurricane destroyed the island almost completely. 95% was destroyed. The reaction from mainland was delayed, was slow. So in the island is 6,000 people living there. So the best thing for them was to just bring 5,000 black bags to put the debt. But it didn't happen. So people like Catalina and other professors, leaders from Providence, activists from San Andres come together, and we start like social media reaction so people can react and help the island. Agro Providencia was fundamental also in that, because her leader, Marcela, is one of the persons that have been working with the grassroots foundation in the island. So she's part, and Agro Providencia is part of the process. So after they arrived, the government arrived like 5 days after. Even the American, I don't remember the American company that, or NGO that send food to disaster region. They was there before the government. So it was a confusion. They didn't know what to do. They create a management office for the disaster, also become a disaster. They didn't follow the architecture, traditional design from the Caribbean. That was another disaster. So Bogota make a big mistake in the planning and in the implementation of this for people to survive after the hurricane. But the community get together, and finally, I think we're out of the basics problem. There's a lot of mistake made. We still have to complain and have to take the company in charge of the restructuration. I think the NGOs is working on that, but there's a lot of mistakes. So what we are doing right now, we're trying to do is prepare the community for when a disaster comes in Providence. We don't want the same thing happen to us. It was a bad experience. People still need assistant, like psychology assistant was very rough. So we had a visit. We had some community leaders from Providence last week in Trinidad, and they was working in Tobago with the office that take care of the hurricane disaster in Tobago. So they was there for a week. They went back now to Providence. So now we are trying to prepare for ourselves with the community for the future. We can't even depend from San Andres because they have the problem. Now Bogota. So we're trying with Jude Marimo and Laura she's based in Panama, to make our own community base in case of another hurricane. So Amparo Ponton is another journalist who lives in Providence. She was someone key to get the reaction from the government. So that is another person. She's a leader from Santa Catalina. So what we did last week is bring over these guys to come and get training for that. So we're going to have a connection with Trinidad and Tobago government, with Providence. We're trying to declare Providence and Tobago city sisters, so we can cooperate between, they can have enough cooperation between the two islands. So that's the stage we are right now. I'm open for a question. If you all have any question, and I appreciate you invite me for this panel, and thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Very brief, but very clear and important information shared there on the post-hurricane experiences, which were compounded by the lack of and limited support that was given, and the inappropriate help that was provided by the different rescue operations that were attempted in the context of the island's destruction. As you said, almost 95% with Hurricane Iota. So we are now going to segue into our roundtable, which you are part of as well, representing for Colombia and the people of Rizal, the Rizal community. We will now have our moderator for this section, who is Dr. Andre Hapet. And Andre is going to take us through a couple of questions fielded to our panelists who he will introduce when he begins. But Andre is an independent journalist, writer, and teacher from Belize. He's also our senior research assistant for the Disaster Capitalism Project. And his work is in environmental journalism, which has appeared in Belizean newspapers, a Mandala, and The Reporter. And he received his PhD from Syracuse University, where he has completed a dissertation analyzing climate policy as a future narrative. Andre, taking the floor now, please. And we welcome our panelists to the roundtable, whom Andre will introduce.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me moderate this section of today's webinar. Before I get going, I just wanted to briefly introduce to you all the people who are providing legal support for the Stronger Caribbean Together project. So we have 3 organizations joining us, and each organization has sent a representative that will be helping the discussion along, providing legal support and feedback. So first we have Melina De Bona. Melina De Bona is a litigation associate at the Climate Litigation Accelerator at CLX. She focuses regionally on Latin America and the Caribbean and topically on corporate accountability and the right to a healthy environment. She has a JD from New York University School of Law and a BA in International Studies from the University of Chicago. Prior to joining CLX, she spent a year specializing in international arbitration, white-collar crime investigations, and sustainability. We also have Malene Alain. Malene Alain is an international human rights lawyer from Jamaica and founder of Freedom Imaginaries, a nonprofit organization that uses human rights law to tackle legacies of slavery and colonialism and contemporary forms of oppression. Malene is a former human rights specialist at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. She holds a Master of Laws degree from Harvard Law School and a Master's of Advanced Studies degree from the Graduate Institute of International Studies, Geneva. She received her Bachelor's of Law from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, and is qualified to practice law in Jamaica and Guyana. Lastly, we have Jasmine Ray. Jasmine is a lawyer with GLAN, where she leads GLAN's work supporting the legal efforts to protect the island of Barbuda and its people from irremediable ecological harm due to foreign tourist developments. She works on the development of a holistic legal strategy addressing the human impacts of the island's residents. Jasmine is particularly interested in environmental justice as well as state accountability for serious crimes under international law. Prior to joining GLAN, Jasmine was a qualified lawyer in international arbitration and litigation in Brussels. She's also a qualified attorney at law and common law. Jasmine holds an LLM from Columbia Law School and Ghent University. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our conversation today. We really appreciate the time. These questions are designed for anyone who is a member of the network organizations to offer their responses. And we'd also be happy to have responses from the legal support network that has been established as part of Stronger Caribbean Together. So to the first question then, Ambassador Bush, I'd be interested to know what you have to say about this in particular. How have you experienced solidarity across Caribbean organizations to further each other's campaigns? I wonder if any of your work, working as an ambassador in Trinidad, has allowed you some time to reflect on this question. If anyone else wants to respond while Ambassador Bush makes his way back, we'd be happy to hear some responses from anyone else.
Partner organizations.
Go ahead, John.
Yes, thanks, Andre. I was about to say, for our experience in Barbuda, we had a quite traumatic experience in that we were basically isolated, the entire community. And so being able, through social media, to be in contact with the outside world, to members of the Barbudan community in the diaspora, and especially to other islands throughout the region, the Caribbean, other islands and territories, which we learned were actually going through the very same situation that we were experiencing. That went a long way in terms of providing us with the kind of confidence to actually continue and because one of the main things that face you in a situation like that is the whole tendency for you to basically just throw your hands in the air and just give up in terms of hopelessness. So that link with the outside world is very important in terms of maintaining your sanity and actually maintaining your position to actually do something about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a response to that question? Aaron, anyone else currently in the panelist network?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in here if that's okay. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see familiar faces, but also really nice to see a lot of new people, and looking forward to connecting also after this workshop. And so, yeah, I couldn't have said it better than John. So I think on a level of creating hope and creating strength in numbers, obviously solidarity within the region is very important. On the legal level, I think we have a lot to learn from each other. I mean, the challenges are similar, but sometimes also specific. And especially in each of these different jurisdictions, there's also different kind of expertise. And so the connection between the different jurisdictions is certainly helpful. And this leads to our efforts being very connected, in the sense that one legal action in one jurisdiction will certainly have an impact in another. So it's very important to align strategies and to have these moments where we have these discussions. And so I'm thinking in particular, when we're talking about Barbuda, about it was presented by the Grenada Land Actors that they in 2022 had a judgment about seeking judicial review from the courts and standing to address environmental impact. And this is exactly what's happening on some kind of other level, but in essence in Barbuda. And that's how there's influence, but there's also strength in numbers. And it's just important to make sure that we're bringing the same argument. So yeah, I just wanted to add that on perhaps a more legal level to the comments already made.
Thank you very much. We just had some of our other network members join the conversation. Margot or Errol, would you like to respond, or okay, William as well? I know that you're on.
For the car, 300 for one car. We have to do that. What about Toyota?
Errol, I know that would you like to share something? I saw that you just took off your mic. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for having me. I must first apologize for being late. I was looking after patients, so I got some time taken away from me. Now, where Jamaica is concerned, we are not although Barbuda had it so rough, we are still not as fortunate as Barbuda where land is concerned. The acts that they have here is for more of the foreigners to benefit than the natives. And what they use in Jamaica when it comes to taking land is bullyism, right? They do not consult with us. The peasants are pushed aside. As I was told by one of the oppressors, that the moneyed people have to get what they want. And this is terrible for us, because whenever they do this to us, we become angry, and it's not good to be able to operate when you're angry. And the anger causes us to split, right? So the disunity that comes in between, because there are some who are for the oppressors and some who are against the oppressors, right? But the majority of us are against the oppressors. We, at this point, are trying to overrule that. And for us to do so, we are bringing together our group with most of the peasants, the farmers, the small farmers, and I particularly say small farmers because what the government is doing is pushing for the commercial farmers, meaning the ones who are going to be using the chemicals and all of those things to bring food. There also is the habit of blaming the conditions in the country on climate change. But we know that this is a man-made climate change. And we are opposing them feverishly. And it's creating some waves there. They are a bit disgruntled with what we are saying and what we are doing, but we're not going to stop. We want this to change because as it's happening now, the government is trying to take away the land from all the indigenous people in Jamaica. We're talking about Maroons. We're talking about the cockpit country. We're also talking about farmlands, especially the farmlands. What they are now doing is urbanizing the farmlands. They are taking away the farmlands from us and building houses. According to the present Prime Minister, he's going to be building cities. And this is creating a problem with our food. I, as a herbalist and also a reflexologist, see the health in our country deteriorating rapidly as a result of their capitalization. And it is causing, once upon a time, Jamaica was regarded as a very healthy country. We can't say that anymore. And this is because of their capitalism. What they have done is turn us away from ourselves. And we are being pushed on the feet. We have to be fighting now to realize ourselves, much less to realize the land ownership. In Jamaica, we don't own land. We are told that we are landholders, which means the government can step in at any time and take it away from us. And that is what is happening now. We are presently aiming at creating our own constitution, as we do not have one. We have a borrowed constitution. And in this constitution, we hope to change this. This has to change. The Land Ownership Act has to change. So the people of the country, the indigenous people, the natives of Jamaica, will be the first to own land in Jamaica. We're seeing that we are on lands and suddenly there's this foreigner that appears to say he's the owner of the land. We have to get off it. A lot of this has taken place. People are displaced, people are disenfranchised, and it has broken down our self-esteem where that is concerned. We, in creating our own constitution, will be correcting all of this. We will not allow it to continue any further. Deterioration of the country when it comes to disaster. We were told recently that we are suffering from a meteorological drought. Well, I looked up to the sky and saw the emissions in the sky, took a picture of it and posted it on Facebook. And I asked the question, is this meteorological or is this man-made? They know that it is not meteorological. But they are telling us that to keep us comfortable. Why? Because they can capitalize on it. What they're actually doing is telling you that because of the kind of drought we're now facing, we need to start using the chemicals that they're providing so we can provide food. You know, in my last part of my presentation, what I would like to say is we need to have consultation between the people and the government and all the authorities pertaining to land ownership in Jamaica, so we can have Jamaicans feeling comfortable in their own country. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those insights, Errol. Melina, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for allowing me to be here. And greetings from Argentina, where I'm currently based, hence why the big sweater. So just to very briefly comment from an outsider perspective, obviously I'm not from the Caribbean, but the center, the CLX, so the Climate Litigation Accelerator, works with partners across the globe. So I hope here to offer a bit of a more of an international perspective and sort of a bird's eye view. So I just wanted to comment very briefly on the question of solidarity across Caribbean organizations. Recently, CLX undertook, in addition to working on disaster capitalism, we undertook a bit of a questionnaire research study where we interviewed people from the Caribbean, across the Caribbean. So different actors for focusing on different types of climate issues and speaking broadly. And what we found there, and I'm curious for you local Caribbeaners to speak back at this, but for example, in terms of coming together regionally, what we found was that there's a lot of movement when it comes to negotiations. So, right, when we see processes like the COP or the UNFCCC processes, the Caribbean countries tend to come together in a way that's actually pretty amazing compared to other regions. And they tend to have a common goal. That's, of course, often at the state level. So where we see a lot of cooperation in those processes, we see that when it comes to climate justice and whatever that means for each country, there is less collaboration. Like countries tend to be very inward looking sometimes, and a lot of domestic and mobilized very well at the grassroots or domestic level, but we see that there is less regional cooperation when it comes to climate justice. We asked people, interestingly, we went with a very sort of blank state, and we asked people what climate justice was for each of them. And we noticed that everyone had a different definition of climate justice. So perhaps part of coming together and perhaps some of the work looking ahead means that people in the Caribbean can come together at a regional level and sit and say, do we have any shared goals? Whether, like Jasmine said, those may be legal or they may be more theoretical in terms of how we understand climate justice, that may be interesting. We also found things that you all obviously, I think, are aware of, but geography and language and even just legal systems play barriers to when it comes to working together. So those are just some of the systemic things that we found in doing our surveys. I think the definition and defining climate justice and disaster capitalism would be a really great point to start when it comes to working together.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Maylene, do you want to comment as well? Maylene, if you're there and you're wanting to speak, go ahead.
Solidarity. And I will say very frankly that I think the legal community has failed local communities. I think that we have failed to build on the imagination and the vision from communities in terms of how we ought to live in the world and how we can build a better world in which all people can thrive in equal dignity. And so in building solidarity, I would say that there needs to be greater spaces for allying communities with legal professionals, so that there can be a two-way exchange where, instead of kind of like imposing views on how communities can achieve their justice aims, It's a conversation because there's a lot of change that needs to happen in the legal profession. And what we basically need to do is, okay, if we must use this colonial legal system to seek justice, as long as it exists, let us build pathways and let us create tools that can help you to, achieve the justice vision that you have. But this requires transformation. And so I think building pathways, building legal tools that are innovative, that build on what there is, right now existing, but strengthens what we have. Because, Errol, when you talk about, those laws, the issue is that we have colonial laws on the book that not only allow, but promote the type of, unfair development practices that you're seeing. We're talking about colonial mining laws that were literally framed to allow mining interests to come and dispossess rural communities. We're talking about governance forms that were literally designed to exclude local communities from access to participation, in decision-making, access to information, and access to justice. And so I'm looking forward to, addressing this question of solidarity in terms of allying movements in a more meaningful way where, we kind of get rid of some of the hierarchies that tend to exist sometimes in these movements and have very meaningful discussions about, since I am quote unquote a lawyer, how existing legal tools can be strengthened and then transformed in a way to build pathways to the future that we all want in terms of living together in equal dignity and harmony with nature. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much for those insights, Maylene. Yes, I definitely agree on what you said there about the need to develop less hierarchical structures within these type of networks. I wanted to move on to another question here that I was hoping some people can have some responses to. What are some strategies you have used that were effective in altering or stopping a policy that would dispossess people of their territory or their rights? I open this question to anyone, either from the region or the legal support members. Thank you.
If I can go here, Andre. Sorry. Yes, strategies. These are very important in terms of addressing the kinds of situations that we are experiencing. Now, you have to bear in mind, for many of us, these situations essentially are threatening your way of life, threatening your very existence in terms of your culture, who you are. So there is no choice in terms of dealing with them. It's either you disappear or you deal with it. So one of our first strategies that we have found to work is to just not disappear, to show up, to be there. So for example, when we were taken off the island and expected to be integrated elsewhere and everyone to accept that, we said, no. The action we took was to basically return to our homes in spite of whatever. So to occupy, to be there, to continue to exist. That's the first strategy you have to make sure you think. The next strategy we worked on was building awareness, having a voice, because we were very shocked to realize that the first thing that was done to us is to basically isolate you. You do not have a voice, you do not exist. You are being spoken of. Imagine sitting down there in a room and hearing a discussion taking place about you, your future, what is to become of you. People are speaking about you and you're not permitted to speak. Okay, it's really frightening if you have not experienced it. But when you encounter that, you have to say, hey, hang on there. Here am I. This is my voice. This is what I want. So having a voice out there is a strategy. So in our case, our first stamp at doing that was to create a Facebook page. It was called Barbuda Silent No More. And it was through that page that we were able to make the first impact in terms of resisting what was happening to us. So whereas the central government was saying that here was Barbuda, for the first time in 300 years, it is not populated by human beings. Here is an island which was 95% destroyed and uninhabitable. Now, all those assertions were false. The international world would not have known that unless we who are there had that voice to say, hey, hang on, no, we were not 95% destroyed. Here is the actual United Nations Development Project study, which categorized the actual damage. And that is not true. The other thing that was very important is that you're sitting there and hearing that the island is uninhabitable. In other words, human beings cannot live there. And here are people sitting in their homes, living, and you have to be able to say, no, that is not the case. So having that voice out there is very important. The other strategy we use is the law. Each territory, I think, has a physical planning act. Development control is part of the body of laws in any country. And as flawed as some of it may be, and some of it not being enforceable, it is really important that the average citizen challenge the government on these points of law. So those are some of the strategies we were able to use and found very effective in terms of allowing us to actually be here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. We appreciate those great insights into the different strategies that you all have been using in Barbuda. I think what you started out with, just showing up, is substantive enough. And I feel like a lot of times we don't give ourselves credit for showing up in these instances. So thank you for making that clear. Does anyone else want to share their insights or response to that? Any one of the other partners? Or yes, Melina, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, and anyone else, please feel free to come in so I don't take over. So in terms of our work, I think generally, again, providing a bird's eye view of what has worked well, not only in the Caribbean, but in other regions, especially in the global South, where we focus. We see that, I think, a big issue that sometimes goes underrated in terms of being identified is the lack of transparency and information, that especially when it comes to disaster capitalism, a lot of times it's, a technique that's systemically used. So in our prior research we've done, both in Antigua and Barbuda, but also when it comes to places like Puerto Rico, where you see disaster capitalism happening, is that lack of information, lack of transparency is used very much as a systemic strategy. So I think that's just important to put out there. In terms of, and Jasmine can talk more about this, but also something else that we have noticed is that there's a lack of perhaps a local legal presence, right? And again, like Melanie said, if we do have to use the tool of the law, which is often not ideal because it is a very much colonial system, no matter in what country it is, if we do have to use the legal tools, I think having local legal presence that's permanent, so that it serves as a pressure point, and they can also track a lot of the information that's often missing about these development projects, would be good. I think then jumping more to litigation, and again, we're the Climate Litigation Accelerator, but really we should be called the Law Accelerator because we focus on how to tweak and use the law in a way that's, that serves justice. But if we do have to talk about litigation, which is often used in other regions much more, I think something that could be useful is thinking about an adaptation case, for example. So, all states, all governments have an obligation to adapt to things like climate change. And often with adaptation, unlike with mitigation, a government cannot make the argument that, well, our mitigation is a drop in the bucket, so we don't really need to do anything about it, right? Everyone has the duty to adapt to climate and to related projects. So if we're thinking perhaps what may work well in the future if the Caribbean, wants to take on litigation, is an adaptation case where you're saying, well, if you're putting a hotel in this place, you're not meeting your duty to adapt, government, or similarly a corporation, by allowing a corporation to put a hotel or a development in a specific place, given how vulnerable the Caribbean is to climate, then you're not meeting your duties to adapt. So just putting that on the table as a potential as a potential avenue that has worked well in other countries in the global south, where governments and corporations are actually held to account.
Thank you, Melina. We really appreciate that strategy that you shared with us here. Errol, thank you. I see that your hand is up. Can you please respond and to wrap up our roundtable today? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jamaica is kind of different. I don't know why we have to be under such pressure. But in Jamaica, if there's anything that massive is against in terms of how they're being treated, you know, the laws and all of that, we try lobbying first to have it changed so the people can be more comfortable. But the main strategy that works in Jamaica is deference. As plain and simple as that. The people have to come out and make their presence felt, make voice heard. Their voices have to be heard. We have to bring out the media with us. Once we start exposing them, then we start to see a light, right? It also depends too on the kind of governance we're under. You know, one party is against the other. There you find there's a little difficulty with one who is more on the bullying side and the other one on the listening side. So in Jamaica, it waves according to the system, but you know, our main strategy in getting things done is present people. Put your voices out, come together and demonstrate. Thank you.
Thanks, Errol. I think I'll just jump in here to maybe conclude the roundtable as Andre suggested. I just wanted to add one thing to kind of all the different ideas that we've heard, because as John was saying, there's different levels that strategies can be thought out. So there's mobilization, there's media outreach and making sure that beyond borders, the story is heard and that support is found. Then there's litigation. I just wanted to make one small point about the litigation, which doesn't necessarily need to be domestic. So what we've encountered is that, you know, we can also use strategies across borders and maybe go on foreign investors or private developers' own turf. In Barbuda's case, the US. And there are tools which, you know, are sometimes a bit innovative, and it's not maybe not the most traditional way, but really it raises awareness within another jurisdiction, which is pretty much responsible for a great part of what is happening. So just wanted to emphasize this transnational aspect of the litigation, which is also very important, and I'll wrap up there.
Maylene, I know that we're looking to wrap up, but please, if you want to contribute something else here at the end, we welcome it.
Oh, sorry, my connection was bad and I didn't hear that part. But just to say, in terms of strategies, I'm rooting it in environmental democracy and reparations, so that communities are involved in access to information, access to participation, and justice as a strategy in and of itself. And using the power of human rights law, which is not only recognized in domestic constitutions, but throughout international mechanisms, whether it's the Inter-American system, or even, you know, using the business and human rights frameworks that seek to hold corporations accountable for their human rights obligations, I think is an important strategy. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants for the roundtable. If it's okay, Dr. Northover, I think we should move on now to the Q&A. And I see already a question here from one of our project members, Tommaso Ferrando. Tommaso asks, what do you think is the role of non-Caribbean people and movements in supporting your struggles? So we'd like to share that question to the members of the network. And if you'd like to reply to it, again, the question is, what do you think is the role of non-Caribbean people and movements in supporting your struggles? So if John or Errol or Margot has anything they'd like to say in response to this, please, we welcome your responses at this moment.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Errol and then John, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I welcome support from anywhere, as long as the support will help us to achieve what we want. So getting the support is just making it better for us. In fact, when I can use an example, Antigua Barbuda has now freed Rastafari, right? They are now regarded as Barbudans, and they can do whatever they want to do with their herbs because they were the first to have it as sacred. Jamaica has not done that. So that's a step forward, and that is coming from what is happening outside, the support that they got outside. So we know that support from you, whether you're Caribbean or non-Caribbean, will always be helpful, and we would welcome it. Thank you.
Okay, for me, I'd like to just agree that the non-Caribbean people, they have a very important role to play. And you have to look at it from the point of view that planet Earth is one global thing. Everything that happens by any state will affect everyone else. The fact of the matter is that most countries have signed on to these important international treaties. So for example, the Biodiversity Treaty, the Treaty on Wetlands Conservation and so on. So when things happen locally, the awareness has to be made, to be built, and the non-Caribbean people have a very important role in terms of supporting these disclosures that are made. So for example, when you have a climate conference of the parties taking place, and you have a prime minister getting up and joining and promoting loss and damage in terms of the whole morality of it and so on, and you are from that island that prime minister is responsible for, and you are seeing that certain conventions are being broken by that very same thing. We depend a lot on the international community to stand up in those conferences and say, but look, Prime Minister, you are saying that, what exactly is happening in your country there? So it is very important that that involvement is there. The awareness has to be there first, and the support that we can garner from the international players. And the strategy which Jasmine has pointed out in terms of taking action in the country of origin. So for example, most of our investors have roots in the US, and there are laws in their countries that they come from, which would prohibit them from doing some of the things that they're doing in our islands. And so being able to get back to their homeland, their home countries, through international players to build awareness and to take action, that is a very critical role that we will have to depend on going forward. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Do any of the legal partners want to jump in here to say if there's any examples of coalition building that they've seen happen internationally between those in the Caribbean and those in countries like John just mentioned, the United States or in the European Union or the UK, that have been successful at working together across borders to limit or mitigate the impacts of certain type of development schemes?
Well, I think, yes, I think I agree that there's an important role to play, and the task is building these alliances. So in our case with Freedom Imaginaries, we do get support from environmental organizations, for example, that have a lot of experience, whether researching certain complex environmental issues or getting information, or even something as simple as putting us in touch with experts. And in fact, the experts that we're using in litigation now have been found through those networks. So I think that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is also, putting us in touch, making other connections that can help to amplify the movement. And on that point, what I would say is that the only challenge in these alliances is to ensure that we're not reproducing colonial ideologies and colonial hierarchies and machinery in terms of inequality. Because what must be clear in these alliances is that we are participating as equal partners, where community, and this is not just for non-Caribbean people, it's also for the legal community that goes into their own local communities as, so-called experts is how they're sometimes framed. But it's kind of understanding that relationship, it's not one of, an expert coming in to say this is how it's to be done, but rather as people kind of working together and building on different types of expertise. So the expertise of communities is not extracted and repackaged elsewhere. Rather, it is, recognized as different types of expertise, and alliances are built on those principles of equality. So, and I'm not saying that we have, I don't think Freedom Imaginaries has it right. I think that, sometimes even in promoting legal strategies, I have to ask myself, is a legal response what communities that we're working with even want? Like, have we imposed a legal pathway when the pathways that people want aren't necessarily in the legal system? So we have a lot of things to kind of think about in terms of how we leverage these strategies. Thanks.
Thanks, Milene. I really like how you open up us more expansively to think about what strategies are useful. We may presume that a legal pathway is what is necessary or wanted without first having that conversation with community members. We wanted to wrap up here at the Q&A by giving just a few minutes to Luz Marina Livingston, who is joining us. She is a journalist from Agro Providencia and would like to speak to the situation there as far as how certain hurricanes in recent years have affected their community. So Luz, if you'd like to share some words now, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Luz. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, and thank you all for this opportunity. I'm a journalist from Providence. Right now, I am passing sometimes in Montreal. But I think of what I've been hearing during the whole morning. The Caribbean, it's like a similar pattern. What's happening in terms of the way how things happening, how the government sometimes take advantage of the situation in community. So for Providencia, after the hurricane, I think it's a lot of challenge, even more than what we had before, because if we see from the point of view environmentally, the damage that was caused by the ETA, which was just a storm, but the biggest environmental damage happened to Providencia after the storm ETA, which destroyed thousands of coral reef, all kind of species. I never see such a thing in my life. I did like a following up with all around the island, and it was just amazing. I describe that like the vomit of the ocean, where thousands of garbage would just heap up, came from all over, was on the beaches, was all around the island. It was impacted, So, and then later, 15 days later, the hurricane Iota came, which destroyed 98% of the island. People were not prepared. The government information were very slow. So it was a nightmare and disaster for the big majority of the community, which, as I say, were not prepared for that. And, when the government nationally came in, the planning was not the best thing, and they imposed the strategy that they do in mainland, which is like never listen to the local people, the way how we live on the island, the way how we build, and they just came and imposed. And right now the situation is, we don't know if the houses that was rebuilt is going to be strong enough to support hurricane, because some of them are built without ties. The structure is very weak, different materials, and so it's a big challenge. And the other aspect of the environment, well, there were no big interference with the environment after that disaster. Like the mangroves of the island, maybe the 50% or 60% is gone. There is no quick plan to reestablish the mangroves of the island. So what is going to happen? Like trees, thousands of trees is on the ground. So if a big hurricane come back right now, the island is not prepared for that, because like I said before, the environment saved Providence people. And we thankfully, we only had 3 people who died during the whole season for the hurricane. But if a big hurricane come right now, we don't have the tree, we don't have the reef, we don't have the coral. What is going to help the island to survive? And then if the houses them are not prepared, it's really difficult. So I just think that right now Providence is going through a lot of challenge, because one of the big things is the environment, is the economical challenge too, which everything is high sky. Food have to be coming from outside. The farmer them on the island right now, they're burning a lot. We had one of the biggest fire disaster 2 weeks ago. The regional peak was burned down because farmer clearing the land for farm. So it's like a big disaster on the island, and we need to organize. The local government need to structure. We need to enforce laws and measurement to protect the environment, the nature. But we are still, I think, behind a lot of the Caribbean country, them who like Barbudas and maybe the other countries, them and people, Jamaica, who are participating in terms of the law enforcement. So Agro Providencia is, Marcella and the group, we're trying to motivate the farmers them, because food sovereignty is very important on Providencia. In the past, we were independent. We grow our own food. Right now, everything is coming from outside on board, from different places, Colombia, and the prices, as I said, is not affordable for the local people. The quality of food is not the best. So if we are not capable enough to plan to grow our own food, we also have a next challenge on that side. So that's why Agro Providencia is motivating the farmers them to let's get together, let's farm, let's grow our food to be healthy for us. But we also, I think, we need organization internationally, Caribbean, to link up so we can, exchange experience. We can see what you are doing on the other side, so we can implement that on our island to keep going ahead. Because as I said, it's not easy at all. I don't know if you all maybe have maybe a question directly that you would like to ask me or whatever, but this is more or less what I can share with you all. One of the things that shocked me during the hurricane season, after the government declared the stage of emergency and they modify the laws, like the what you call the law for migration, the national government kick it down. So they brought in 2,000 people. The island of Providence, which originally is 5,000-6,000 people, you were into so much stress, seeing so many people from mainland coming, and now we have an overpopulation situation also that is circulating, that is tremendous for the island. And the next thing that for me as a journalist behind the scene, I saw, like, when the hurricane happens and you had an international organization who wanted to come in and help. Well, guess what? The government from Colombia, they were an obstacle. They did not allow organization who wanted to come and help the island. They wanted was to manage everything, because there was a big plan. The plan was studied by them when they knew about the hurricane hit the island. The plan was financially, economically, it was corruption, because right now, the big budget for the hurricane has been a disaster. The corruption that went through this process, we never lived that before. So, like, one house that they build, they say it's costs right now like 700 million pesos, which we never had that before on Providencia. So this was like a big plan, how to rip the island, and they take advantage of the money from the hurricane. But this was a big foot move from the national government. So that is like what I can tell you all. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for sharing those comments, Luz. At this point, I think we'd like to move on to our vote of thanks by Dr. Northover.
Yes, greetings everyone again from Jamaica, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for being with us in this webinar and allowing us to hear your voices, to hear your questions, as also thank you for your listening and being able to be informed as to what's going on the ground versus some of the strategies of silencing and misinformation that is taking place. I just wanted to highlight that in our webinar today, we really emphasize that disasters are not necessarily natural, but rather man-made experiences that are rooted in long historical processes of vulnerability, as well as the actions taken place on the ground in the post-disaster context, the opportunism that takes place in these environments with the increasing uncertainty and disarray that happens, the confusion that emerges with that impact from, for example, a hurricane. So some of the themes that have been highlighted, challenges, in the post-disaster risk management and reconstruction efforts, the non-inclusiveness of the processes that have been taking place, that is leading to additional damage, increasing the risk, increasing the damages that are being faced by the community, the lack of recognition of the importance of our ecological and environmental assets and its capacity to reduce disruption. And these questions in terms of building resilience are not being addressed. So when we're building back, are we building back better? So one of the big themes that have come out from some of the experiences being shaped is this whole question of the disorder that is accelerated post-impact, the dislocation and the corruption that is taking place in a post-disaster context, which is really the characteristic of disaster capitalism. So one of the other challenges that have been highlighted are the experiences of deracination, which is a term that John introduced to us from Barbuda, Save Barbuda, given the extreme impact of being taken away from the communal land and the histories of survival and resilience that were there, embedded in Barbudian land society relationships. So this was also spoken to by Errol when he says the practices that we have in place in development context, as well as these disaster post-reconstruction contexts, are turning us away from ourselves. We're becoming uprooted. We're losing our rights to feed ourselves. We're becoming displaced, disarticulated. So these are all experiences which can be, couched under the term deracination that was introduced by John, which is another challenge, the uprooted characteristics that are needed in order to make populations vulnerable to pursue certain agendas which are self-seeking and not motivated by community interests and broader long-term sustainable development actions. The other challenge issue was the importance of civic activism, and that activism was highlighted by Aaron Caton from the Grenada Land Actors, and how important it is to bring on board local legal actors who can support the community. So alongside this need for embeddedness of the legal actors alongside with our social actors is the need, which was emphasized when we're looking at in our roundtable, for solidarity building, for internationalism, both legal and social, that we need to break the silencing and misinformation that takes place, the isolation that takes place in a disaster context, by having the organizations that we have here today and others, legal associates, bring on board their expertise and their, as as one participant has said, take a bird's eye view of the situation to understand what is happening in the global south, to see the connected challenges, and to realize that there is strength in numbers, so that we are no longer, as Errol stated, being bullied and being led by interests that are inimical to the well-being of the population, the communities that we seek to support, which is at the heart of the principle, I believe, that Melaine emphasized in her closing remarks in the roundtable of reparatory environmental democracy. That is having a democracy that is not just engaging with the issues of voting or inclusion in that very narrow sense, but having deep inclusion where communities are rooted in the process and the environment and their rights to the environment, their ecological embeddedness in their societies, in their environment is important in building democratic processes, moving away from the narrow frameworks of law towards and the decolonizing law in order to build a better and more sustainable legal democratic space for persons to hold their governments and to hold corporations accountable. And I think that at the end, the whole business of trying to mitigate disasters, to have disaster reduction, implies transformational strategies. Resilience that includes not just adaptation or bouncing back, but actually changing deep-rooted causes for the long-term vulnerabilities and the impacts that are experienced on the ground when there is an event. So we must resist disaster risk creation, and we must therefore have a combined effort to focus on the interdependencies and the relationships that need to be brought to the forefront in order to have a better sense of how to resist together, Caribbean, stronger Caribbean together.org as being the only way in which we can have a sustainable future. So I would just like now to give some brief remarks. So please visit our website. That was my plug for our website, strongercaribbeantogether.org. And there we'll also see an upcoming event, which is our first podcast that Andre and Christina, our research assistants, have curated for us. And we will have a little sneak preview of our song that was created for our podcast. So it just remains for me to thank all the different persons who made this event possible. First of all, I wanted to say thank you, hearty thank you, despite the technical difficulties that we had in starting on time. I want to thank our technical team, Ishmael and Richard from the University of the West Indies, who have been supporting the work of this webinar on the technical side, and the translators, Maria Jose, Natasha, Robinson, and Noe, who are behind the scenes but working, very, consistently, studiously, trying to let us have language justice within our conversations. I want to thank the presenters who made this such a rich feast of engagement, the different perspectives that we were facilitated from John, from His Excellency Bush, who is Ambassador for Colombia and Trinidad and Tobago, but also a member of the Riser community, Mr. Aaron Keaton, Jasmine Ray, Melina Debona, Meline Alain. All of you made vital contributions and made it possible for us to have such a rich understanding of the challenges and the strategies in response to these challenges brought on by disaster capitalism. I want to thank our network members who jumped in and provided their own perspectives. So from the Bernard Lodge Farmers Group and others who jumped into the conversation, in addition to those who were invited in our panel, including the journalist who spoke at the end on the situation in Providencia. I wanted to thank as well our project research team, Professor Tommaso Ferrando, whose brainchild this project is really. I'm the executor, the principal investigator at the University of West Indies, but Tommaso is an incredible lawyer, human rights, human law professor. I take it for granted that you're a human, Tommaso. So Tommaso, big up for your vision and your tenacity and your work behind the scenes as well, supporting and guiding us throughout all the stages in this project and towards this webinar. I thank our very capable, efficient, and dedicated senior research assistant, Andre, big up Andre from Belize, who had did such a wonderful task and moderated in the roundtable. Thanks to Christina for her lovely slides, emphasizing the points and making it more visible, digestible than text that I provided in my own presentation. So thank you so much as well for your work on the flyers and the program development and the research, background research on the community members in our project. And Samia for her excellent work in providing website development. Samia Andrewin, big up. Thank you so much, because without you, we wouldn't have this virtual space, this website that is now going to help us to amplify the voices of the persons who we are trying to stimulate to work together, to think together, to fight together, and to win together in this struggle against disaster capitalism. I want to thank our sponsor as well, the Open Society Foundations and their representative, Aura and Teresa, who have been very supportive in all the work that we do. I want to thank as well our composer of our podcast song, Alexander Evans, for his really lovely, and I think he responded very well to our suggestions as to how we wanted to capture the mood of this project. Last but not least, to the audience, everyone who was present today, who came in early, and those who came and had to leave, thank you all for your engaging presence, for your questions. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for your solidarity. And we will, when we have completed the editing of the webinar, have a recording of this event posted on our website. So I think that is it. Please do watch our website, strongercaribbeantogether.org. You'll see any new updates and information. You can join and become on our mailing list, and you get updates from our team on activities that are taking place. But then you can research and find out what is happening in the Caribbean on this website and see all the detailed information that John was talking about in relationship to the struggles and the facts as they are on the ground. So I just like to close now and also ask that we have our final song, our podcast, and then our closing song for this session. Thank you all for your solidarity and your support.